Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 58 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly panel discussion. For IABC Fellows, join me for a conversation on a topic of interest to communicators. We have a big one to talk about this month, the integration of internal and external communications, something that people talk about a lot. And we have four highly qualified IABC Fellows to join us in this conversation. So I'll introduce myself and then have you go around and introduce yourselves. I'm Shell Holtz, moderator of this panel, and I am the Director of Internal Communications at WebCore, which is a commercial general contractor and builder working in California and headquartered in San Francisco. And I will go clockwise, starting with Jim.
My name is Jim Schaefer. I live in Annapolis, Maryland, and I focus on working with large organizations for the most part to help improve organizational performance through stronger leaders and more engaged, excited people.
And next is Priya.
Hello, I'm Priya Bates from Toronto, Canada, and I lead inner strength communication here in Toronto, and we help organizations enable, engage, and empower their employees to deliver results and manage change.
Next is Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela Senecas. I've worked both in internal and external, and then also as a VP of both in charge. But currently, for the last 20 years, I've been running my own agency doing primarily communication research and measurement.
And Alice.
I'm Alice Brink. I'm an independent communications consultant. Most of my work right now is with internal communications clients. And I think what's notable about the work that I do relevant to this discussion is the fact that most of the clients I work with are B2B. And so their internal and external communication challenges are a little bit different from consumer-based companies.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are watching in real time, please feel free to ask questions or share comments. This is being broadcast over YouTube. That's how I suspect all of you are watching. And you can just use the YouTube comment feature. I'm monitoring that here. If for some reason you prefer Twitter, the hashtag is COF58. And I'll monitor that as well. So yeah, let's jump into this. I should note that today is the day after the final day of the IABC World Conference, which was done virtually this year. And I thought they pulled it off really well. I think they demonstrated that you can have a virtual conference over 4 days and deliver real value, and not everything, obviously, that you would get out of an in-person conference, but from the professional development standpoint, I thought it was first rate. Priya, you were there for most of it. What did you think?
It was, I was saying that I felt like I hit a wall after all the learning, which I probably would have done in person as well, because it was incredible. The experience was much better than I expected. Yep. And the content was top notch. Every session I attended was excellent.
Yep, I agree. And the ability to engage with other attendees was terrific. I don't want to spend the whole time we have together on this. I just thought I'd mention that since it ended just yesterday.
And they deserve the credit too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And
Natasha, it was very well done.
The driving force behind making all of this work. So kudos to Natasha. So this topic, let me kick off this topic of the integration of internal and external communications. I got into this business in 1977. I had been a newspaper reporter before that. I joined a Fortune 50 company that had 55,000 employees around the world. And if they wanted to know what was going on in the company, the only way they could do that is what their boss told them, what they got through the grapevine, and what they got out of the 8 to 12 page weekly printed newspaper that I worked on and that was distributed to all of those employees. They didn't get to see, generally speaking, the Wall Street Journal or the Western Oil and Gas Association magazine or the American Petroleum Institute publication, most of them were working in jobs where those were just not around. So very limited in where they could get that information. They didn't see the press releases that the company put out. There was no place that they could go to see the press releases. And by and large, they didn't see the coverage that those releases generated in the various publications they were distributed to. It was also true that the people who were watching the company from the outside had no clue what was happening inside. There was no way to get any sense of how the company treated employees, what employees and departments were up to. There was this giant wall between the inside and the outside. Today, to distribute a publication, I think is fine, or digitally, or however you communicate with employees, but they're reading about you in every publication that covers you, because they're all available on the web. You can search your company name on Google. There are other ways that you can check into the company. There's Glassdoor, where you can see what other employees feel about the company. And you can go right into the company's website and read all of the company's press releases and everything they're doing to position themselves externally. In the outside world, those folks can read Glassdoor and see what's going on inside the organization. And now we have, Edelman telling us that the number one factor in the way you perceive a company is how that company treats its employees, which is out in the open. We now have employee activism with employees staging walkouts and being very public in their protests against company behavior. Is this what's driving this trend toward the integration of internal and external communications, or is there something else or more?
I think absolutely. Sorry. I think absolutely this is driving the trend. One of the sessions we just talked about the IABC conference, and Max Luthi talking about this glass box that we used to feel like we were in a black box where you could keep your company secrets inside and separate that from what was happening outside. And that he talked about this concept of radical transparency. And I love that term, that everything is, we really need to think about it with that lens in mind, and how we ensure that what's on the inside is also reflected on the outside.
I think I agree that it's certainly trending now because of all these reasons. But Roger Dupree decades ago was talking about the importance of connecting employees with the marketplace, because that's how they could provide better service or products to the marketplace. So the need for doing it has been discussed for a long time. I think the current events is what's making it more urgent, I guess, but it's always been a good idea.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I did an article for the good folks up in Canada, connecting the workforce with the marketplace. And one of the things that I talked about is that the internal communication people are starting to make a significant move in some cases, where they are not just shoveling out stuff. Instead, they are managing the communication process inside of an organization, which is everything from what leaders say and what they do, to systems and processes like reward systems, learning and development, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things communicate to people just as the formal channels do. So what I'm seeing happen among the internal people is they're starting to work more with the external people and the role that they have to play and the results that they have to create. So there's sort of a circular model. The model starts with the employee communication, sharing information that helps people in the organization make decisions and take actions that are affected by the customer. So that circular model is something that I think we're going to increasingly be working with, and it's consistent with what you just said a few minutes ago.
I agree. I think the other piece of that is the fact that employees are the brand, and that's another idea that's been around for a long time. Not just how employees are treated, but how employees feel about the company, and how employees understand the company and represent it to the people around them.
There's a funny story. I was working with a healthcare client, and they were rebranding, And they did a really nice thing. They shared the new branding materials and the commercials with employees before it went live, right? So it's a good idea. The only problem is when employees saw the commercials, the basic reaction was, wow, what a great company. I only wish I worked there, because they really hadn't made any changes internally to be able to be any different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that this whole concept has led to that I'm not wild about is the idea that employees are just one more stakeholder audience for a public relations team. Let me tell you a story. Okay. I was doing work with a quasi-governmental agency in Washington, D.C., a big one that you've heard of. I was working on developing their very first internet, which will give you an idea how long ago this was, back when I was an independent communicator. And they decided that they needed an internal communication strategy. I couldn't take that on. I was really busy doing the work I was doing, but I recommended somebody that all of us know who does internal communication strategy. So they put it out to bid. They included him, but they also included their current PR agency. I won't name them, but they have the initials H and K. And they ended up hiring H and K. They got a deal on the consulting because they were already paying them for external work. And I went to lunch with the two people they assigned to this, and we were talking. I asked, what kind of background do you have in employee communications? They said, none. We've never worked, either of us, in employee communication, but it's just another audience. We'll be fine. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about the integration of internal and external, is it? Is
No.
there anything you think it is?
No, absolutely not.
No.
And why
I
not?
think internal.
Go ahead.
Internal is the butterfly effect audience. It's the linchpin. If you fail with internal communications, you get the kind of stuff that Angela just talked about, where people say, "Oh, you're going to represent yourself externally like that?
The other thing I'd also say is what I've been saying a lot with my clients right now is when we approach things like PR, we focus on the campaigns, and when we approach it from an internal communication perspective, we focus more on the conversations and that consistency, and that's what we're looking for. I think that PR companies have come a long way. H&K has come a long way. I know in Canada, one of the people I brought up and trained is a VP in internal communication practice there. So I'm hoping that they're doing things differently, and I believe they are. But it really is a different skill and a different focus in terms of what you're trying to drive.
I think it's really a mindset shift as well. Because if you have somebody from a PR agency that came from the journalism world, it's all about news. It's just distributing news stories one way or another. And internal communication, as Jim was saying, it's more about the process of helping the business succeed. So just news stories alone isn't what it's about. The other thing is, for that external perspective, they're fighting for attention for their own client. In the big marketplace against competitors. Well, with employees, they're a captive audience. And if you start trying to market to them and sell to them, you are completely turning them off, because they live there. Anything you're telling them is critical to their survival, their jobs. So there's a whole different shift, not only in what you communicate, but how you approach it. I mean, just one funny story back from when I was that VP of communication. One of our operating units, we had a very simple, plain newsletter that went to employees, but it really covered necessary operational information and recognition, a really nice variety of things. But the VP of marketing said, you know what, we need to take this and really make it better. We have to make it glitzier. How about if we combine your budget and my budget, and we turn it into a quarterly 4-color magazine, and we can give it to both employees and customers and prospects? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Completely misunderstanding. If you're going to be purposely telling things to the outside world, they're going to be things that are only sugar-coated and pleasant and happy. And employees need to know all the down and dirty stuff as well. So it's just the whole mindset of make it pretty, make it exciting. And that's, while there's nothing wrong with making something look attractive for employees, to make that the focus, it's the wrong mindset.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Angela. And this is a little bit what I was talking about a little bit ago. It's sort of the the light-minded approach. It's the easy approach. It's the get it out the door approach. And this is one of the things that I've been spending a whole lot of time in the last few years with, is helping improve on-time delivery, because the reason we were having trouble and we were losing customers is the people inside the organization from the various parts of the organization that had to deliver on products and services were not communicating well with each other. And as a result of that, they had a reduction of on-time delivery of about 50%. We were able to bring those people together and teach them how to communicate as a process and as a system. And we were able to get about a 70% increase in a reduction in on-time delivery. And I can go through story after story after story like that, where it's the breakdowns inside the organization, people not talking to each other or not saying the right things to each other, that are causing a lot of the performance problems in quality, service, cost, speed, productivity, et cetera.
I always say
I worked.
sorry, the difference is kind of like the difference between dating and marriage, right? That when we're dating, we're trying to be sexy, we're trying to get their attention, we're doing all those things, which tends to be the PR approach. But when we're in a marriage, we're kind of stuck with each other for a little while. At least we like to be, and we need to open those lines of communication and talk about our changes and talk about the ups and downs. Because without that, if it's all sugar coated, we're not going to trust each other.
Yeah,
A great analogy.
It's perfect.
And
Perfect.
Angela, you
Yeah.
brought up Roger Dupree. I know Roger has referred to employees as informed insiders, which I think really distinguishes them from any other stakeholder audience, just in terms of the fact that they have insights and they have context that no other audience has, and therefore their information needs are different. The other thing is that employees go through things that require communication support that other communicators who specialize in external audiences have never dealt with. I'm thinking of change as one example. How many media relations people have ever worked in change management? So there are skills that we bring. So when we talk about this difference between internal and external and integrating them, what's involved in each, and where are there similarities and differences?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the similarities are clearly understanding how to think strategically about communication, how to research your audience, how to develop strategic messages, and how to get the audience's attention, and then how to measure those results. Those processes are very similar, but like Priya said, it's the dating versus the marriage. It's really, I think there's a lot more need for two-way communication when you are dealing with an internal audience, because you have an audience that is at least to some degree committed to you, and you need to build that commitment and over a long term. And there's a lot of transparency and honesty that has to occur there before any of that can happen externally.
I think there also has to be, I think we have to start from a place of mutual respect, right? So we're joking around as folks that are very committed to internal communication, saying, oh, external communication doesn't understand. But we, just like with any other partnership we have in the organization with human resources and IT, we need to know that each of those groups offer a skill, and there's a need for what they do, and what we need to focus on is talking to each other and make sure that our messages and our actions and our behaviors are integrated.
So does it make sense, if we're talking about integrating these two functions, for them to be housed together in the same department?
Oh yeah, like 2 feet from each other.
Go ahead.
No social distancing.
I have done a number of studies, Shell, on this about whether they ought to be housed together or not. I don't think that's the real issue. I think the real issue is the extent to which they work well together. I've worked with external people and internal people. There's sometimes when they ought to be housed just because of the geography of the business and that sort of thing. But I don't think that's the fundamental issue. I think the fundamental issue is that they need to be working together. They need to have the leadership support. They have to have a business case for what they're going to do, and it needs to have an integrated brand promise. and they need to be able to work together, whether they're in the same building or not. I think we've learned something from this problem we've got going in this world right now. You think about it, how many people were out in their houses for this whole thing? They weren't housed together, but they had some really, really great presentations, and they had some really good stuff going on. I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think our buildings are going to start to empty. Our airplanes are going to start to empty because people have realized they can sit in our houses like we are today, and we can get an awful lot done. I think that's the same thing, and I think that's probably going to increase. So probably the housing of internal and external is probably going to be not as important as it maybe used to be.
I have an example that's very current. I'm working with a client. I've been supporting them internally for several months, and they just hired a new director of communication and gave her the responsibility for marketing, which had been in a completely different department, reporting up a completely different chain, and handling media relations as well as actual trade shows and other branding and other marketing pieces. And they really are in the process of discovering how disconnected the two areas have been because they weren't working together. So whether they're really sitting next to each other, I think in the organization, they need to be adjacent, if not in the same place.
And I've reported to, when I was inside organizations for 20 years, I've reported a number of different ways. And if I would rank the success that we had, most success when I reported into the head of strategy, the strategic group, and then we worked really closely with PR. Second, definitely when we were part of an integrated function. So corporate affairs working together with the internal communications or part of an integrated marketing communication team. That went really well. Least effective, I have to admit, is when I reported to human resources.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Because the focus was always on the benefits and the HR programs.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying from an HR perspective, you can report to HR, and a lot of my clients are HR leaders. but if they are open to what is possible and are actually working to solve the business problems, that focus will help us solve the business problems.
Sure.
Yeah, so the right leader will make a difference from an HR perspective, but most often in my experience, if it's an HR leader who's only focused on the HR programs, and that's what they see the role as internal communication as being, and not giving access to the leaders, then it falls apart.
It becomes a penalty box.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, I've only reported to HR in my career. And I have definitely spoken to people who say, I report to HR, and they think I'm here to talk about benefits and all the HR stuff, and they're not interested. I've also talked to people who reported through the PR or external affairs side, and he said, I'm not allowed to talk about anything that wasn't covered in a press release. They don't want employees to have knowledge that is different from what we're presenting to the outside. I don't think it matters where you report as long as you have leadership that understands the role of internal and how internal plays nice with the others. We have a comment here from Brian Kilgore that says HR departments are responsible for punishment.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
Layoffs.
Yeah, I've had a client say, "Well, we can't put this person's name in our internal communications until we've checked with HR to make sure they're not on probation for anything." I'm like, how did their name come up to be praised in this story if they're
You gotta wonder.
Yeah.
So I was working for. I had just started working for a pharmaceutical company in 1990. And was a bit blindsided when we announced the launch of a big new product externally that employees didn't know about because nobody had told the internal communications department it was happening. So I put together a weekly meeting. It happened to be face-to-face because we were all in the same area. One guy had to drive 20 miles from the advertising agency. We had a wholly owned advertising agency, but we just went around the horn, right? And what are you working on this week? What are you working on this week? So there were no surprises and we could coordinate. And it worked extraordinarily well. Is that type of thing the be all and end all of this concept of integration?
We need to be talking to each other. Go ahead, Angela.
I've seen one structure in two different organizations that work really well, because it's not so much separating internal and external and finding a way to work with them. The main concept is you've got some people who are responsible for certain channels that are dedicated to certain audiences. So you might have one person who's in charge of the employee publication, one who's in charge of the intranet, one person who's responsible for media relations, one who's responsible for the external website. So you do have some channel managers, because there's just a lot of day-to-day stuff that has to be done to manage a channel. But the content was being generated by strategists. And the strategists either lived in different functions or geographies, or they just had a liaison with them, where there was like their beat, like a reporter's beat. They were responsible there. So whatever something was going on in that organization, or they had a business need, that person, that communication person, was responsible for generating all the content that would go to all of the audiences. So that way it's already integrated, because it's one person generating the content. That was then handed over to the person who knew the media, had the media relationships and knew how to pitch to that audience, and the employee editor who would then get the right photos and headlines for that audience. But that way it was integrated from the start, because it was a single communicator who was generating all those messages. The only exception was investor relations, which typically reports to finance, and that's just usually another animal.
And what I would love is when we decide in organizations who needs to be at the table. So whether it was a program, a service, a crisis, the first question would be who needs to first be at the table. And that included operational leaders. And then we also had one person who represented from a communication perspective. And then we created our communication table that had internal, external, and all the different groups that were involved. And we would take turns leading. So if it was a labor disruption, or if it was reorganization, I would be the lead from a communication perspective and be ensuring that all of our communication internally and externally was coordinated. If it was like a product recall or a big crisis, which we went through several of those, then it would be the PR or the crisis person who led, or the government relations person who led, just depending on what was going on.
I think bench strength is a big issue. I've been in a situation where I was the communication manager and I was responsible for internal and external, and it was just me. And when there was hot news to deal with, it was very difficult to balance those internal and external needs just on a time management basis. So I think that we need to make sure that we're not neglecting one or the other when we're integrating them.
We have a question that has come in over Twitter from CommsGalNJ, New Jersey. Do you think an integrated editorial board is the answer?
For internal,
what's the question? Yeah. I mean, what to affect
for
what?
integration?
The answer to a process for integration of the functions.
I think that's one answer.
Yeah. When we have, when we're launching a new technology platform, or when we're putting together, new intranets, whether it's with clients or when I was inside, understanding who the subject matter experts were in the entire organization was really important. And that way, Alice, you were talking about bench strength. Sometimes you're the only person who does everything from a communication perspective in your organization, but being able to build those communication advocates throughout the organization, from HR and from IT and from marketing and all those groups, and having that editorial board to get information from, and also share what's going on in the organization, absolutely was really valuable for us to all have a finger on the pulse of what was going on with the organization.
Mm-hmm.
If you bring these internal and external organizations together, and let's be clear, external communications can involve multiple teams, right? You have your media relations, you have your corporate affairs, you have government relations, you have community relations. Those are all external functions, often part of the same department, whereas internal might be elsewhere. Everybody's got their own MBOs, right, that they need to achieve. Their bosses are expecting them to do certain things. So they come to the table looking out for their own interests. How do you bring everybody together so that you're working together for the common good of the organization, as opposed to meeting the objectives that have been set for your department?
I think it starts with the leadership. I think if I were in a communication function and we were talking about this sort of approach, I think I would start by getting my leaders on board and help them see how an integrated workplace to marketplace makes business sense, and that it's much more effective and much more efficient. I would then work with the leadership and whatever part of the team is appropriate to build a business case for an integrated brand promising and brand building effort, however you want to call it. And then I'd back up and I'd say, what capabilities do I need? Capabilities being the things you have to be successful. And what is it going to make us in terms of the capabilities that we have? And then we start building, your reward systems, your incentive systems, and your development systems, and all that behind it. But I think if you don't start with the leadership, having a full appreciation of integration on the business of the business, I think that you're going to struggle a lot as you get down track without having got started the right way.
Is there any value in establishing a charter for the group that represents the integrated team, so that when you come into that room, you're working toward that charter as opposed to your departmental goals?
I think so. That's a sense of purpose. It's the purpose why we're here. And
yeah, I'm also thinking it's how content marketing tends to work, right? You start with this is what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Now let's look at all the different audiences and the different channels, and what do we bring to bear on each of those?
Isn't that Gold Quill 101? Right? Right? Like, so we can talk about content marketing, but it's like when we talk about Gold Quill Awards, it's coming to the table with what are our goals and what are the communication objectives that we need to deliver in order for the business to meet its business goals. I think every group that's created, whether it's operational or communication, needs to have those goals really front and center, and then understand the foundations, which are your values and your missions and your visions and your purpose, and layer that onto what those goals are.
Yes,
and then also understanding the stakeholders, which is the other thing, and that's what everyone's bringing to the table. Because I've seen times where we had a media crisis, and they just wanted to focus on the outside. But I said, you know what, our employees are going to be really angry about this situation as well. We were in a situation where we were being blamed for something, but it was actually our client, the fire department, that had made the mistake. So employees were all wanting to talk to the media and say, it's not our fault, it's them. But of course, if they did that, we would lose the contract. So you have to understand what all these audiences, all these stakeholders are likely to do and feel and think, so that what you come up with works for the whole group.
There are a couple of other external audiences that I don't think usually get discussed when they talk about the integration of internal and external audiences. I'm thinking, for example, of sales, which is communicating to an external audience. I'm thinking of recruiting, which is usually within the HR department, which is communicating to an external audience. Talent branding in organizations that are large enough to have that kind of function is promoting what the culture of the organization is like to prospective recruits. And then there's employee advocacy, where we're actually asking our employees to engage in their online communities, outside audiences. And I've seen a Venn diagram that the two circles overlapping. One is who you reach through your external communications, and the other is who your employees reach in their online communities. And it's only about a 15 or a 16% overlap. So the potential is there to reach a lot of external people with your own people doing it. So, I mean, these are a lot of different approaches to reaching outside stakeholders. Is that too much to try to integrate? How do you deal with that, as opposed to just the PR department and the internal communications department talking to each other? And we're not even talking about advertising yet.
I worked with a client recently that was working on that exact thing. They were suddenly in a position where they needed to be recruiting after not really needing that for a while, because they're in the energy industry. And of course, now they don't need to recruit again. But while they were in the recruiting mode, they started trying to figure out, how do we want to market ourselves? And when they went to employees to talk about what makes this company special, they realized that they had a lot of messages that employees needed to hear themselves say. And so the campaign became an internal branding campaign as well as an external branding campaign. And that made a much stronger message for both audiences.
Sorry
And there,
about that.
and there needs to be connections there, doesn't it? Like if the internal brand is very different than how they're selling themselves outside, then you're gonna have that distrust at the end of the day. And that's something that's really, really important. Layer on top of that, everything that's happening right now with the Black Lives Matter and the focus on diversity. And I don't think organizations really understand what's coming from an employee advocacy perspective, both inside the organization and outside.
Yeah, very
Priya,
true.
can you talk a little bit more about that, about the impact of what is inside being reflected on the outside?
Well, yeah, if I'm layering on right now, there's so many statements that are going on because companies feel like they have to say something and take a stand when it comes to Black Lives Matter and diversity. But there's all these conversations that are going on behind the scenes and openly, more than they ever have, about what are they really saying and what are they doing. So we're beyond what I'll call the platitudes and the promises, and we're starting to have conversations around processes and practices and proof that you're actually doing this, right? That you're planning to make a difference. And I'm starting to see some really interesting activity that's happening globally. Elizabeth Benacuda, I think that's her name, has just introduced a blueprint. Have you guys heard of this? This is literally a few days ago. She's somebody who started, a woman in the UK who started talking about very openly about her experiences as a Black woman in PR. And then she'd been working on this initiative, I think, before about creating a blueprint for diversity in PR agencies and in PR tables. And she's just launched it in the last couple days and has actually given a Blueprint Ally certificate to a couple of 3 organizations in the UK. I think we're going to start seeing this, and then CIPR in the UK has actually endorsed it and published their own data recently. Like, something people think this is a trend, it is a movement, and it's a global movement, and it's bigger than George Floyd. And I think that the organizations not only need to think about the statements they're making out there, but what are they actually doing that's real? Because people can't not, the first thing you do when you hear from an organization talk about diversity is Google them and look at their management board and management team.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see is white.
Yeah.
Right?
No,
Well, I think we as an organization need to, IABC, be very cognizant of our own record in this and our own failures and successes in terms of being and encouraging diverse membership and diverse voices.
So one of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, Shell, a little bit ago, you mentioned a number of different demographic groups. And I think the one that perked my ears up was when you talked about sales. I see so many people in sales operations. They're out there in their cars. They're distant from people. They don't have access sometimes to information. I'll give you a very brief case study, and that was with a huge building materials company that you all know. And they had an operation in the Dallas area. They were up in the upper Midwest. And the salespeople were pretty much left to their own devices and didn't have the information about pricing strategies, delivery times, and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, it was a very bad situation that when we finally helped them get it back in order, they had about a 45 to 50% increase in sales, and profitability was much higher than before. So I think that sales operation is always one you want to be looking at.
I think when we start with that, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I was just going to say that a lot of times when we start a project, we really have to look at all of those stakeholder groups, because there's a lot of hidden ones too. And they're not necessarily important for every single issue that we're going to be communicating, but for some, they're critical. It could be the people who live in the neighborhood of a plant that's having a problem. It could be family members of employees. It could be volunteers for your healthcare organization. It could be retirees. And so you really have to make sure that you're not missing those groups, just because there is no communicator in charge of communicating with them, especially like with sales, if there isn't a special channel for them, because they are a channel of communication in and of themselves. So that's why you need to start with that discussion of who could be affected by this, who could be doing something differently to help make this better.
Yeah, when you talk about the integration of internal and external, I have found that, well, Roger Dupree always called the middle management the frozen middle. It's where information goes to die. And I was when I was working for the pharmaceutical company, once a quarter, I went out to spend a day riding along with sales reps, because nobody ever heard what they were telling their leadership that the customer was telling them. Because the people in the middle that they reported to said, "Oh, if I pass this bad information along to my leaders, I'm going to look bad." So it just sort of hung there. And I would, try to convey to the company that this is what the sales reps are hearing from customers. We turned that into a feature in every issue of the monthly magazine, interview with a customer, what they like about doing business with us, what they like about doing business with our competitors, what they don't like about doing business with us and with our competitors. It's really short.
Yeah.
The people loved it because they never heard that. They said, wow, I could do something about that in my job. That's a form of integration of internal and external,
Sure.
isn't it?
Yes.
I think the
Absolutely.
mobile apps now too, right? That with all those remote workforces, a lot of the internal communication apps are designed to bring in those mobile workers or shop floor non-desk workers, so that they have the consistent information, consistent messages in order to do their job or focus on health and safety. I think that's really starting to change the game. Great stories about fleets, truck drivers who are going across, North America or wherever they deliver product, and being connected and creating community, because they represent that brand when they're out there, but they're also feeling connected with the organization they're part of, because they now can do it on their phone and feel that they've got personalized information.
Angela, you were talking earlier about Roger's belief that we need to connect employees to the marketplace. Have you seen some good examples of how to do that?
Some very simple ones and maybe some more complex ones. And research is one way to do that. So I remember the first time I kind of realized this is I was working again at that company where I was VP of communication. And there was a customer satisfaction survey done at one of our operating entities. And so then I started talking about how we're going to communicate this to employees. And there was horrified faces at the table going, we can't tell employees about what customers think about us, because what if they tell other people? What if the competition hears about it? And I said, so if we don't tell employees what they hate about us, how are we ever going to change that? And then there was resounding silence. So you don't have to share the percentages. What you can easily do is say, look, we had 100 questions on the survey. Like any other survey, 10 questions had the most positive scores, 10 had the lowest scores. So without saying how high is or how low is, we said these 10 things they love about us, let's make sure we keep doing it. These 10 things they like the least about us, let's figure out how to take care of that. So that's a very simple way. That's existing research from one side that could and should be shared with the other. But you can also do this proactively. So we had a semiconductor company where they were having some problems on the production side. Things were not being delivered on time. The quality was poor. And so they had a customer satisfaction survey. We knew what customers thought, but we were doing a change in the middle of a change process and doing a survey related to that. So we added in a couple of questions of how do you think customers rate us on timeliness, product quality? And not surprisingly, the employees thought those were really good. Customers loved us. And when we shared the real numbers with us, that's when the change process really began. So just the third example I want to use is back to the salespeople that Jim and others have been mentioning. I had a reinsurance company, and they had a lot of different communications that went out to customers, but some of them were managed by the sales force. They could choose which people to invite to different events, which people should be on a mailing list for different communications, which brochures to use. So they had a lot of discretion. We were doing this big customer communication survey where we talked to these executives, and we went channel by channel and asked them how useful they were. It wasn't just how useful were they. It's like, have you ever done any of these things after you've read it? Have you decided to hire this company instead of its competition directly because of something from this communication? Or did you call them in for a sales visit directly because of this communication? So we're connecting these communication vehicles to behaviors that have a financial impact. So we did that, learned all that useful information. But then we added another little thing. We did a mini survey of the sales force that made these decisions, and we asked them how useful they thought each of these channels were. So predictably, there were things where they agreed. They were right. They guessed correctly what customers did like and didn't like. But there was this huge group of communications they completely underestimated the value of. And once they took the ability to keep customers away from these communications, away from the sales force, they were able to get more of these communications to the customers who were then generating more business for the company. So you can do that very purposefully to find out how the internal perception of the external world is matching up, and then make some really significant changes that really affect your business results.
One of the things that I did when I was at Mattel was we found that we were getting regular letters from kids. And we went through them and found some that were just utterly delightful and charming. We ran them in our magazine, and it was the most popular feature we ever did. Direct feedback from the children that we were designing and making and selling these toys for. One thing that's happening where I work right now, the marketing team has relaunched the external website, and they have this news section that they need to feed. And where a lot of that content is coming from is the intranet. Articles that have been deemed non-proprietary but interesting enough for the outside world are going there. So the outside world is starting to see what we're talking to employees about. And somebody raised the issue that, gee, if the content for the website is being produced by internal communications, shouldn't there be maybe some budget shift?
Yeah.
When you talk about this integration, does it start?
And who mentioned that? Mr. Internal Communications.
No, not me, I swear. But does it set up some of this vying for budget when each department is working in the other one's sandbox, so to speak?
I know that at a point when my internal communication team became larger than the PR team, and the PR team also had a whole agency behind it, which I didn't. There was a little bit of angst about it, because there's always been this a little bit of a superiority complex, that PR is more important, and I definitely didn't have the budget they had, but when they saw that team get bigger, it seemed to be a problem. But that team continues to be larger in the organization because it's needed, and I think, and it's really about what are they working on? They're working on business imperatives, change management, ensuring that large audiences of an organization of now 200,000 people are informed and are delivering the customer experience that we expect.
Priya, I really agree with that approach. And one of the things that as I'm working with communication practitioners, one of the things I always tell them is start with the result in mind first. Mm-hmm. Let's don't start with the activity we're going to do, because you're going to may just spend more money than you're going to gain. So let's get our focus on what is it we want. We have an on-time delivery problem, we got a cost problem, whatever it is, and specifically, what is it to the problem? What are the root causes of the problem? How are we going to make them go away? I think when we approach it from that perspective, instead of, let's all come around and try to fix some cool stuff around here, you're going to get more attention on it, and you're going to also probably get more results. You're also probably going to get more value at it, because the cost of getting the gain is less than the gain that you get. So you basically have added value. But always start with the result. That's what I keep telling communication people. Stop this. We got to get a newsletter out. Stop that. What are you going to fix out there?
I want to let those watching live know that we have about 11 minutes left. So if you have a question or an observation, please share it just in the comment field in YouTube, or using the hashtag COF58 on Twitter. How do you get started building the relationship between internal and external if it doesn't already exist? I have definitely seen organizations where these silos are pretty solid and distant from each other. So if you're going to start to move toward this integration, how do you build that relationship?
I said earlier that, and I believe this is at least my answer to it, is you get the leaders on board first. You get them to understand the value of an integrated workforce or workplace. And then you establish a business case for doing what you're doing. And then you start building the capabilities that you need, which are the things that you have to do well in order to be successful. And then you start allocating resources beyond that. But if you don't start with that leadership team, you're going to have a struggle for some time.
And it can also start with the planning, right? What are the plans for the year? Who needs to be involved? Where are we going to put our investments, both from a resource perspective, platform perspective, process perspective? But if we have a plan that we're all aligned to and goals that we're all aligned to, it helps us to work together better.
Well, and that's exactly what I was saying a little bit ago about have the goals aligned to. You know what those goals are going to be. You know what the results you're going to try to create. You know what the investment is going to be. You know what the value that's going to come out of it is. If you've got a plan like that, that ought to start to work.
Another opportunity sometimes is crisis, because when you do have a crisis, everyone does start pulling together. And when you see the power of that, if you can then institutionalize it afterwards for the ongoing planning, that sometimes can be that catalyst to get it going.
Angela, what about research? If you're trying to bring the teams together, is there a role that research can play there?
I think some of the examples I used were showing the value of either doing a fresh survey to get this information or sharing the results of a survey. But I think there's other types of research as well. Some of it is what you mentioned, those ride-alongs you were doing with salespeople. That's a very important part of research. I basically hired one PR agency once just because they offered to do that for one full day for each of our 4 companies at no cost so that they could do a better job for us. So that kind of research, really getting to know who those stakeholders are, internal and external, is really important. It can be done with these ride-alongs, interviews, focus groups, also just reading what people are saying online, whether it's external social media or internal social media. You can do a real quick read on it by copying and pasting everything that's there, putting it into a word cloud program, and start seeing what the big trends are that you should be paying attention to. So it can be very simple research like that, or some of the more complex ones I mentioned.
Angela, you mentioned doing ride-alongs. I was working with a bakery in Chicago, and this was back in the day when we wore dark suits to work every day. And they asked me if I would ride along with them to help them discover what they need to be doing to sell better. So I rode in the back of the truck, and about the 3rd time that we went to one of these customers to gather this data, the person at the next place said, "It looks like you've been riding in the back of the truck because you got all that flour all over that navy blue suit." I said, I hadn't even noticed it. I was just trying to hang on to the back of the truck. A very well-known baking company, too, in Chicago.
And that's important, not just for us communicators to do, but even for our executives, because then they begin to understand what the issues are. Although I do have to give you a caveat. We had one executive who was a CFO, and when he was riding along with one of our ambulances, of course, we had to be trained for that, had to get hepatitis shots so that we knew what not to do when we were there. But he just created this huge viral outbreak of information, because when he was on the ambulance, he said, "Wait, you're taking people on board the ambulance before you get a credit card swipe?" So you have to be really careful who you put out there in the field and how you prepare them.
This is funny story. Who can tell?
I think the point. I was just going to say, I think the point is that you can start the coalition building from any direction. The thing is that it needs to start, and whether you're able to access the leaders and get them on board, or whether you're just able to partner with another piece of the communication team and create that partnership together and then bubble it up. Any way that you can do it, you have to start working together.
So what does that look like structurally? I mean, we're accustomed in the world of business to having somebody be in charge. And here you're talking about different departments with different leaders. Is it just the senior most leader of one of those departments who takes charge? What does this look like structurally?
I like Priya's approach that depending on what the nature of the issue is, who is that best person to take on this particular project?
Yeah.
Situational.
Exactly. And that requires respect for what everybody brings to the table. Right. And it's starting with who are we and then where do we want to go? What are our pain points? What isn't working right now that will help us work better? What are the results that we want to achieve? And then who needs to be there to make that happen? But it's acknowledging where you are and what those pain points are in order to drive some change.
Another thing
I've seen.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've seen leadership come from all different directions. I've been in departments that reported to a lawyer. I've been in departments that reported to an HR person. I've been in departments that reported to a communications trained expert. I've been in departments that reported to an engineer. But the key is to have somebody that has the vision. It has to be the right person who has that big picture vision and that willingness to look at all the different audiences and priorities.
The one thing I was just going to add is that in getting to that respect level that Priya's mentioning, one of my clients did something really interesting is when somebody would be on vacation or maternity leave, or if there was a crisis, they would very easily move people around throughout the whole communication organization. And they did not all report to the same place, but they got the leadership on board to do this. So if they needed extra hands in one place, that's where they went. Mm-hmm. And it didn't matter if they were internal or external. And so what they did is they learned a lot more about what each other does. And that started building not only that respect for each other, but real human relationships that made it easier to work together when something else happened.
That's great.
Yeah, that's an important selection process. It really puts a lot of importance in that. We did a project in LA, a pilot project for FedEx, and they put together 15 people. And I thought it was going to be difficult to work with, but they put the right 15 people together and did a very good job. Improved foreign business by about 1,447%. So it was a real success. I was concerned that we had too many people in the room, but they had picked the right people.
That's awesome.
Does that make it necessary when you're pulling this group together to do some sort of a skills inventory and find out who has what skills and what you're missing?
I think
if you're not doing that, you're missing a point.
And you kind of, some do it formally, but I think there's a little bit of instinct and informal ways that the right teams that come together kind of know that you need these different skills, different areas of expertise, that will really make it a stronger team.
Mm-hmm. And I also like involving the team in the selection of other people that they're going to have to work with, because they know those people better than anybody, and they know who they want to work with. And it ends up being much more of a cohesive group.
We have an interesting situation where I work in that my department is internal communications, and yet we're responsible for social media. My associate at WebCore handles that. But a year or so ago, she recruited one of the people from the marketing side to help her, and now they're a team. So there are representatives of both functions in this single unit, and that seems to bleed over into other things that we're talking about.
That's great.
And I think it has really strengthened both sides of that equation.
Yeah.
I thought the funny thing when I was inside organizations, and I find myself doing this with clients now too, is because I'm always bringing in the right people and talking to different groups, I know who's who. I know who is responsible. And I get to a point, I remember in every organization I belonged with, when the receptionist started calling me saying, who's in charge of this program? No matter how big the organization is. And I sometimes do that with my clients saying, do you know this other person is working on this initiative that you may want to be interested in? It's just getting out there and talking to people and understanding what they're working on and becoming that expert on who's who in the zoo. It was amazing how many times external or marketing or brand would come and say, oh, Priya will know who's involved in this initiative.
Yeah.
We've got less than a minute left, so I want to take that time to thank all of you. This has been a great discussion. I think it could have gone on for a while more. Appreciate the time, the expertise, and the enthusiasm. I also want to let everyone know that the next Circle of Fellows will be on Thursday, July 16th, same time, which is noon Eastern time, episode 59. The topic is entrepreneurship and how to be a successful consultant improving results and value as a business advisor. And joining us on that episode will be Kelly Garrett, Jim Lukaszewski, Mark Schumann, and Jennifer Waugh. There was actually a flood of fellows who were interested in doing that one. So we're doing a second go around on that topic all the way out in January 2021, when hopefully we'll be not locked down anymore. But Alice, you're going to be involved with that one. So is Amanda Hamilton Atwell, Todd Hattori, Marianne McCauley, and Angela, you'll also be in that one. And we may monkey with that topic a little so it's not just a duplicate of the one that we do in July. But with that, I want to thank everybody. It's been great. We'll see you next month.
Thank you,
Right,
Shel.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Oh, yeah,
to see you.
definitely thanks to Anna Willie for all the behind-the-scenes work.
Yes.